Hello, and welcome to the virtual Scandinavia House. And today's book talk, The Viking Heart, How Scandinavians Conquered the World with Arthur Herman, out now in paperback by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. Arthur Herman returns to discuss themes that have gained new relevance over the past years. So we're excited to hear those new themes. This talk is being recorded and will be made available on our website, scandinavians.org, as well as our YouTube page. Feel free to ask questions in the chat section, and we'll get to them towards the end of the program. I will also put a link to where one can purchase a book in that chat function. Arthur Herman is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, author of 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller, How the Scots Invented the Modern World, Gandhi and Churchill. His novel, Gandhi and Churchill, was a finalist of the Pulitzer Prize, and he lives in Washington, D.C. So please welcome Arthur Herman.
It's a pleasure to be here. Very happy to join you again, talk about the book, and also to talk about and update some of the themes and issues surrounding the book and its reception, which I think you'll find very interesting. And I hope if you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, I hope that now that it's available in paperback, that will tempt you to visit the book and to learn more in detail about the themes that I'll be talking about this evening. And I'm always happy to hear from readers who have been able to find out things about their own Scandinavian roots, about the history of the Vikings, about the history of Scandinavians in America that maybe they didn't know about before, or aspects that they think are particularly interesting that they need to bring to my attention. Always delighted to have that happen. Well, this book, when I originally wrote this book, one of the things that I wanted to do with it was to really suggest that the story of the Vikings as an historical episode in history, in Western history and world history, is one that really doesn't stop with the end of the Viking Age, that it really is the story of a certain cluster of cultural attributes, of mindset, of a way of life, which has persisted through the centuries, that had its origin before the Vikings burst onto the historical scene in Scandinavia, but which then became part of the fabric of Scandinavian history up until today. And thanks to the Scandinavian immigration to America, have become an irreplaceable and important part of our story, of the American story as well. And I have to tell you that one of the things that's been so gratifying about the book and the reception of it is the way in which people who don't have any Scandinavian heritage, who aren't in any way connected with the story in a personal way, the way I am, as I explain in the book, both of my mother's parents came over from Norway to America. My father's side, his great-grandfather came over from Norway half a century before Anna Carlson and Karsten Flayton came over. And yet the fascination with the Vikings, the fascination with that age, and really also a fascination with Scandinavian history, Scandinavian culture, of the Nordic countries, and the ways in which they have established a way of life which is distinct from, but also, as I explain in the book, is rooted in that long-term history. It's just been the great reception that I've had, and I've really been grateful to the readers and commentators who have really helped to really promote the book and to get it the kind of reception that it's had. And believe me, my publisher appreciates it too. So let's begin at the beginning and think about that question that I started with originally, and that is not just who were the Vikings, but also why are we always so fascinated with them? Why do we continue to have movies, for example, that explore the Norse mythology, like the Thor movies that have come out of that whole Marvel Comics series, up to number 6 in the series? Quite a franchise they've managed to put together. including one that ran this summer. Why are we so fascinated with it? And in order to begin exploring that, of course, then we really have to pin down, again, just really who the Vikings are. And what we know about them is that they were a distinct group of peoples who arose from the modern day nations of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, who engaged in a series of marauding raids and seafaring expeditions that not only despoiled their neighbors in the rest of Europe, but also opened up a series of sea routes and trading routes on which the future world economic system was going to depend further on. And the story of the Vikings is therefore not only a part of the history of Scandinavia, or even just the history of Europe, really is a part of world history. And the fascination that we have with the Vikings, I think to a large extent, extends not just to their character, their ferocious character. If you want to put on the first slide for us, Kyle, we can get some picture, the popular picture, but also the picture of that age of what the Vikings were like. And there they are, as represented in a 12th century chess set, an ivory chess set that was discovered on the Isle of Lewis, which was for a long time part of Viking settlement, Viking raids. And we can recognize these figures as very much the look of your typical Viking warrior, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, doesn't matter. And particularly that figure in the foreground, the one you see biting his shield, is almost certainly the artist's rendition of the most notorious of the Viking warrior types, the Berserker, who were known for their ferocious, almost irrational exuberance for battle and combat. Here, the idea of the Berserker was that they were actually captured by this sort of animal spirit of the bear, of the wolf, and that they were transformed from human being into beast of prey, who would then be launched forth against their enemies and against their opponents in battle. The Berserker representation here is one, in other words, it kind of sums up, epitomizes that fearsome image of who the Vikings were, the kind of ruthless, rapacious, savage warriors who terrified their neighbors, terrified each other as well. I mean, the infighting that takes place among the Scandinavian tribes all through the Viking Age far exceeds, in terms of body count and ferocity, anything that they imposed on their neighbors in Germany or France or England or Ireland or other places where their marauding expeditions took them. And this is an interesting chess set for a couple of reasons. One is we really do have a kind of snapshot of the popular image, medieval image of the Viking warrior. But it's also interesting because thanks to DNA research, and one of the things that I did in writing the book, The Viking Heart, was I really wanted to mobilize the most recent DNA research that's been done on the Viking exploration, Viking settlements, Viking graves, and the way in which this has also brought a whole new dimension, new way of thinking about who the Vikings were, where they went, how they intermarried and became part of the communities that they pillaged at first, but then ultimately settled it. But the DNA analysis of this chess set, this ivory chess set, has also been really interesting because what they discovered is that the ivory comes from the tusks of the narwhal, the horned sea mammal that was so plentiful in the waters surrounding Greenland and the coast of North America. But there was almost certainly, as we know again from the DNA left with this chess set, that these were chessmen made from narwhal tusks from Greenland that Viking warriors perhaps traded and acquired from indigenous people. We don't know. who killed the narwhals from which the horns were extracted, but that were then traded across the Atlantic on the other side of the Atlantic, in the British Isles and in the Hebrides and the Isle of Lewis in particular here. So in this chess set, what we get, what's so fascinating about this is we get, on the one hand, we get this image of the ferocious image of the Viking warrior, fearsome Viking warrior, but we also see the trace of just what their geographic reach really was, and the way in which that kind of Viking exploration and Viking voyages were not only exercises in marauding and robbery and pillage, which they were, but were also about trade and ultimately about settlement and spreading a range of economic ties and cultural ties all across Northern Europe and then across the Atlantic as well. So this is the Viking Age. The Viking Age, historians usually date it. We know who they are right now. We just mentioned who they were, but let's talk about what the Viking Age was. Usually historians date it from about 792 with the famous raid of Vikings on the monastery at Lindisfarne and the English coast, which really kind of woke up the Christian world to who the Vikings were and the threat that they really posed to the outside world, to the so-called civilized world, to Christendom. And then the Viking Age, the classic Viking Age, usually is dated as ending in 1066 with the Battle of Stamford Bridge. You thought I was about to say the Battle of Hastings, but it's the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which is actually the more decisive one in terms of shaping the future of relations between Scandinavia and the rest of Europe, because it's in the Battle of Stamford Bridge, just a couple of months earlier, before King Harold of England meets William the Conqueror on the battlefield at Hastings to decide the destiny and who will sit on the throne of England. It's the Battle of Stamford Bridge that Harold and his Anglo-Saxon troops decisively defeated the last great Norwegian king, King Harald Hardrada, or King Harold the Ruthless, as he's sometimes called, or Harold of harsh counsel is also often the translation of his Old Norse nickname. That decisive battle in the north of England, just outside York, really represented the end of 2 centuries of Viking raids and conquests in northern England and in the British Isles, and really ushered in the end of the Viking Age. And it's ironic too, because the 3 antagonists in those battles, Harold of the Anglo-Saxon king, William the Conqueror, the Norman Duke, and then King Harold of Norway, all 3 of them had deep Nordic roots. Harold's mother was a Dane. She was a Danish princess. And although, of course, he spoke fluent Anglo-Saxon, he almost certainly spoke fluent Norse as well, to reflect his family and the degree to which there was a Norse influence in the court in London and in England in general. And then William, whose family's roots lay with the Norwegian marauders who settled in Normandy, the land of the Northmen, and who had established an independent duchy and considerable political power in northern France. So powerful, in fact, that the kings of France themselves ended up having to negotiate with these powerful and very dangerous warriors who had established themselves on the northern coast of their kingdom. So, we want to go to the next slide. So we have them see them first of all as great warriors, of course, fearsome warriors, dangerous in battle, ruthless in victory, and persistent in defeat. Defeat the Norwegians once, and they'll come right back at you again and try again until finally they succeed. But it's also it's important to realize that what made the Vikings such a dangerous and formidable opponents for the rest of Europe, and everywhere they went, in fact, was not just the fact that they were very skilled soldiers and skilled warriors. It was also the technology, particularly the 2 nautical technologies that they had harnessed in order to expand their power and their influence. And we can see them here in this 19th century painting of a Norse longship braving the waves and the weather in order to make its way to some distant shore somewhere, perhaps an unknown location, where the crew and their chieftain are headed. And those two technologies were, first of all, the longship itself, which was the product of centuries of seagoing craftsmanship in Scandinavia to establish ships that were incredibly buoyant and self-supporting, even in the roughest seas and weather, but also at the same time had very shallow drafts. So it was very easy for a ship to go from becoming a seagoing or even ocean-going voyage to shift to make its way up river, deep into river valleys, and to, when necessary, surprise an enemy who never thought that Viking warrior or Viking raiders would be able to get this far upstream in order to conduct their marauding raids. And that kind of upriver and even fording and portaging ability is one of the things that made the Vikings raids such a threat. The kind of shock and awe that they were able to bring to bear because of that, being able to row their way up river valleys, row their way along coastlines, even with very shallow waters, made them a real threat, made them really dangerous. Now, the second technology is the other one that you see here, and that's the square sail. Because with the square sail came not only the ability then to harness the wind power in order to travel over long distances and travel over long distances very quickly, but it also helped to establish the stability of the ship, even in rough weather and in rough seas. It gave the whole enterprise of setting off across the seas an ability to move with speed and mobility and versatility that really no other seagoing nation or people of the time could ever match. And those voyages, even now when you think about them today in the age of almost instant transoceanic global travel, it's just incredible that they were able to, from those small inlets along the North Sea and the Baltic, were able to expand out westward across the British Isles, which is where the Danes and the Norwegians particularly excelled in their raids and voyages. And then, of course, eventually from there, even further west across the Atlantic, first to the Faroe Islands, then to Iceland, Greenland, and then finally on the coast of North America at about 1000 AD, about 1000 the Christian era, when they established their first settlements there. But also, too, to extend down south along the coast of the mainland Europe, through the Straits of Gibraltar, conduct all kinds of raids on the settlements and towns and cities there, reaching all the way to Athens at the far end of the Eastern Mediterranean. But then, too, in the case of the Swedes, conducting voyages that would take them up the river valleys, the Dnieper and the Dniester and the Don, expanding across Russia. Can I have the next slide? Where in no time they established their hegemony over the local tribesmen. This is a 19th century portrayal of one of those hegemons, the Viking chieftain Rurik and his two companions, who established themselves as rulers over a large stretch of land in what is today modern day Russia. In fact, that's how the name Russia was acquired. Was because it was Russia, meaning the land of the Rus, which was the local term of art among Slavic tribes for who these Viking warriors were. They were the Rus, a term which means the men who row, very apt term for describing Viking raiders and Viking travelers and merchants at the same time. But in other words, that this is a global expansion that not only reaches across the Atlantic to North America, but also reaches down into and establishes the entire history of Russia and of Eastern Europe as well. It's all laid out by the result of those Viking raiders. And they didn't stop there. They proceeded on into the Black Sea, conducted a series of raids on Constantinople, at the time the most powerful city of the most powerful empire in the world, the Byzantine Empire, and then reaching all the way to Persia, and even Viking merchants who made their way as far east as Baghdad. It's an incredible story, and all done in an incredibly short period of time, less than 200 years. It's a tribute not just to the technology of these peoples, or just a tribute to their incredible, at times reckless courage. It's also, I think, a tribute to the fact that their staying power, because as we know, as the years, the decades, and then the centuries rolled by, they went from being raiders to traders to eventually settlers. And what they found, whether it was in the land of the Rus in Russia, or whether it was in northern France in the case of the Normans, or whether it was in the British Isles in the case of the Danish and Norwegian raiders who would settle there and really create the Kingdom of Ireland. Ireland is, in the DNA evidence really supports this now, it bears this out, that Ireland really is a Scandinavian and Viking creation. The city of Dublin certainly originally took its roots as a Viking base for conducting war and collecting tribute from the local Irish tribes. That all this is about a peoples then who bring to bear an incredible skill set and who use it to establish for themselves rulership over huge portions of Europe and beyond, but also who to make new lives for themselves in the places where their skill set, their ability to their self-reliance, their loyalty to chieftain and king and clan and family, their willingness to take great risks, to go out and find the treasure, to go out and find the goods that support the community that they've left behind, their ability to build homes for themselves, for their families, wherever they go, no matter what place they are. This is a skill set that the world needed in the Dark Ages. It's a skill set that had also become then part of the history of Europe, thanks to those Viking marauders and the legacy that they left behind in the process. Next slide. Now, partly as a result of that, not only did the Vikings change Europe, Europe changed the Vikings. And I talk about this at length in the book, and I hope you'll have a chance to sort of look at the chapters where I talk about what happens in post-Viking Scandinavia, the changes that are brought. Almost certainly the most important of that is the coming of Christianity and the impact of Christianity, although it took a long time. Swedes, Norwegians, Danes held out for a long time, clung to their pagan ways and their pagan gods, Odin and Thor and Fricka and Freya and the rest. But eventually, the impact of Christianity, of Christian missionaries, the building of Christian churches, and the growth of a Christian culture in Scandinavia, even though it was imported from outside Scandinavia, outside Europe, would have a profound impact on changing the way in which the successors to the Vikings came to think of themselves. And I think that impact comes in two stages that I'll mention right now. One is, the first of them is just the way in which Christianity brought an awareness of the role of individual moral responsibility. I can't think of any other way to phrase it right now. But the degree to which the idea of conscience, Christian conscience, of being aware of one's ability to sin and ability then to redeem oneself through faith in God and through the rituals and place of the church, had an enormous and I think ultimately beneficial effect on the shaping of Scandinavian culture here. You know, the thing about the Vikings is, the thing about being a Viking is never having to say you're sorry, right? No matter how many massacres, no matter how much damage and rampaging they did, there was never a moment when a Viking warrior sort of would say to himself, my God, what have I done? That doesn't occur, but it does with the inculcation of Christianity. It teaches that sense of moral responsibility, that we have responsibility to our souls and to the souls of others, to behave in a certain way, to treat them in a way in which we ourselves would want to be treated. This is a huge impact on Christianity everywhere, but particularly, I think, in shaping the direction of Scandinavian culture, because that skill set, that daring, that self-reliance, that the pride in workmanship that we see, for example, in the great stavkirker, which are the physical legacy of the coming of Christianity across Scandinavia, particularly Norway and Sweden. The magnificent wooden churches that were built as part of the growth of a Christian Catholic culture in the Scandinavian lands, that impact here is one that now has with it too a kind of sense of moral weight, a sense of responsibility towards others, which I think persists and has lasted in as part of what we think about as far as Scandinavian and Nordic culture to this day, including the way it shapes the mindset of those who are not necessarily of the same linguistic and ethnic background, the Finns in particular, in the way in which they came to see the world as well. But that impact came in the second stage, which is the coming of Lutheranism, the Reformation. And there, what we see is that Luther's ideas, Luther's version of the Reformation, had a sweeping impact across Scandinavia. Really, there's something about Luther's teachings and Luther's doctrines about Christianity and a return to the real roots of biblical roots of Christianity had a big impact on the way in which Scandinavians came to think about themselves and think about their relationship with God and the way in which they came to understand the relationship with each other. And as I explain in the book, talking about the coming of the Reformation to the post-Viking Scandinavia, the big impact was Luther's idea that of a calling, that each of us, no matter how humble our station, no matter what our place in life, no matter what our sex, no matter what our age, each of us has a calling and a role to play in our love of God that we communicate through our connections in our work with others. That, in other words, that there is a Lutheran work ethic, which is to do our best to achieve our highest possible level of excellence in everything that we do, not just in order to gratify ourselves, not just in order to enrich ourselves, but that this is a form of love for others, and that the connections that we build with others rest then upon this faith in God and the faith in the bond that we build through the pursuit of what it is that we do through our work, through our calling, through our vocation in life. It's a very powerful message and a very constructive one as well, because now we come to see that what we do, what we build, the lives and careers and professions that we undertake are not just for ourselves, it's for others. It's to support them, and it's an expression of our love for others that comes with it as well. And I think this too has a very deep impact on the way in which Scandinavian culture, up through the modern age, up to today, continues to exist. The way in which philanthropy and doing things for others, and of providing, looking for ways in which to take one's own skills and to use them in ways that benefit the entire community and benefit the entire world. Big part of what it is that makes Scandinavians so, I think, so happy, shall we say? It's an important part of that sense of happiness, of self-satisfaction that everybody understands and grasps when they travel in Norway or Denmark and Sweden. These are people who ultimately are at peace with themselves and at peace with their communities here. But I think it's also what it is that drives a lot of the envy that we often have about that level of happiness, that sense of cultural solidarity, of communal support, and with that too, that it's not separate from the idea of individual responsibility and individual freedom in the same way. So this has the impact of the Reformation is a huge effect in shaping modern Scandinavian culture, but also shaping the history of Scandinavia at the time. Could go to the next slide. Because with that acceptance and embrace of the Lutheran Reformation comes inevitable conflict with the great Catholic powers of Europe, who were determined to stamp out that that Protestant Reformation, particularly in Germany and Northern Europe. And in the struggle, the inevitable struggle that came to Europe between Catholic and Protestant nations for hegemony of Europe, emerges one of the great heroes of Scandinavian history, one of the great heroes of Swedish history, King Gustavus Adolphus, who took that faith, that Lutheran faith, who took that sense of vocation and calling and brought it to the world of geopolitics, of using Sweden and Sweden's power and the professional army which had developed by his forebears in the Vasa dynasty, but which he himself had shaped to a level of perfection, of military perfection, which is really hard to grasp today, to understand how Sweden became the great military power of Europe in the 17th century. I talk about it at length in the book and go into more detail about it. But it was one that was able to turn the Swedish army into the instrument for not only saving the Protestantism in Germany, but also raising Gustavus Adolphus almost to the pinnacle of personal power in Europe. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 was really a test for how Sweden could, if you like, perform above its weight as a European superpower, and that almost carried Gustavus Adolphus to the pinnacle of power, even to becoming Holy Roman Emperor, if tragedy hadn't befallen him on the battlefield at the Battle of Lützen in 1632, which ended his life and became a permanent check on Sweden's ambitions to become the great power of Europe. Now, if you read the book, you read the chapters in Viking Heart where I talk about Sweden and Scandinavia in those years, what you'll come to realize is that his successors as kings of Sweden continue to push that great dream of Sweden as the great power, embracing Norway and Finland and large chunks of Poland and northern Germany, as well as conquering Russia. That this was a dream that really consumed his successors, and also to consume the resources of Scandinavia for the next 100 years. Certainly a king like Charles XII or like Gustavus Adolphus are among the most celebrated, the most important military leaders in the history of warfare, with their unsurpassed brilliance and with professional crack army that they managed to build for themselves to raise to that level of power and influence and prestige and glory. But there was a price to be paid, as I explain in the book, for this. And that is that in the 17th and then in the 18th century, the resources that might have been spent to make Sweden and its dependencies into economic powers and to bring prosperity and trade to that part of the world was spent instead on wars and armies and fruitless, in the end, fruitless conquests and competition with much more populous and much more powerful, ultimately more powerful nations like Russia. And that there was a price to be paid for by the ordinary people of Finland, of Sweden, Norway, and even Denmark, as a result of missing out on the big changes, the big economic and social changes that were sweeping across the rest of Europe. And instead, by the middle of the 19th century, 2 centuries after the death of Charles XII, what we see is a Scandinavia which has fallen further and further behind the rest of Europe in terms of economic development, in terms of prosperity, and in terms of being able to escape from the poverty trap that overtakes, that we in our lifetimes have seen overtake third world nations, is what now became the common experience for ordinary people living in places like Sweden and Norway. And as I explained then, for those ordinary people facing a life of hopeless poverty, of the kind that their parents and grandparents had known, they seek it out, find an exit. And the exit that they find is, next slide, increasingly America. And that's really the whole story. The whole story of the Scandinavian immigration to America, the great migration that really got underway in the years after the Civil War, although by the 1850s it was already getting started, and from the 1870s through till World War I, at least 2.5 million immigrants from Scandinavia to America was precisely the result of a homeland which could no longer feed and no longer provide for the material needs of families scattered all across that Scandinavian landscape. And so they came to America. And of course, many of them sought out land that looked familiar, that had, for example, great forests, like the great forests in Sweden and Norway and Finland, that they were inured to the cold, the harsh cold that you would face on the Great Plains, inured to the hard life of carving out a life for yourself and your family in the midst of a wilderness. After all, a large part of life for rural poor in 19th century in Scandinavia looked a lot like that, had for centuries in many ways. And so you have groups like these. These are Swedish lumberjacks from Mora, Minnesota, picture taken of them about the 1880s. And so they fit right in with the kind of conditions that the American frontier provided for those who were courageous enough, strong enough, and had the skill set necessary to carve a life out for themselves and their families in the frontier. But what's striking, and I explain this in the book, what's striking about this is that they came here to America and not anywhere else. I mean, a few went to Canada. But unlike the other great diasporas of the time, and I wrote a book about one of them, the Scottish diaspora, which preceded it by about 50 years before the Scandinavian diaspora comes to America, that unlike that of the Scottish diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, the Italians, who likewise fled poverty to find better lives for themselves. Unlike those groups, almost all of the Scandinavian immigrants came to America. They didn't go to Latin America. They didn't go further south. America is what drew them. America is the place where they wanted to live and where they wanted to settle. And I think the explanation, as I explain in the book, is a pretty clear one. And that is that what they saw in America was the land of not just the possibilities for making a new life for themselves. With these endless acres, I mean, compared to the arable land available in Norway or Sweden, it was just unimaginable what the farm you could make for yourself in North Dakota or in Iowa here. It was just it was beyond one's dreams, the possibilities for creating a life for yourself and your family there. But also there was the very ideal that America expressed, which was the idea of liberty. That this was a land, this was a republic that was founded upon the principle of individual liberty, and where you could go to find a path for yourself and for your family and for your community, to which you were responsible and you alone for what happened and what you created and what you did here, without interference, without having to submit to the authority of church or state or of the local landlord or local aristocrat here. And next slide. And I think it's that belief in America as the great land of liberty that really drew so many of the immigrants who came over in the 1840s and 1850s that drew them to the cause of the Union during the Civil War. I have a chapter about this in the book, about the large numbers of Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish immigrants who became staunch supporters of the Union, staunch opponents of slavery, including the commanding officer of the 15th Wisconsin Regiment. These are the veterans at their reunion 20 years after the war. These are the veterans there at part of their regimental reunion. The commander of their regiment, the 15th Wisconsin, Hans Christian Haig, whose father was a leading abolitionist and journalist who come from Norway, and who also raised that regiment when Abraham Lincoln had called for volunteers in order to preserve the Union, but then also to prevent the spread of slavery, and then finally, ultimately, to the abolition of slavery as a part of the great cause that Americans would flock to and for which they would sacrifice so much, including, of course, Hans Christian Haig himself, who was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga. Now, among those reunion members, by the way, among the soldiers who volunteered for the 15th Wisconsin was my great-great-grandfather, who joined there, who'd come to Norway in the 1850s, had moved out to Freeborn County in Minnesota with his family to farm, heard the call from Hans Christian Haig to rally as Scandinavians, as brave successors to the Vikings, to defend liberty, to stand up for the Union, and who answered the call, and who went and served and was badly wounded, in fact, at the Battle of Stones River in December of 1862. And I have to tell you, again, it was when I wrote those chapters about Scandinavians in the Civil War, and also described my own grandfather's account of what it was like fighting and serving in that campaign. I had on my desk the actual mini ball that had been extracted from his knee from the Battle of Stones River. It was a family keepsake that was passed down through the generations. So it was a powerful moment, I must tell you. But it helped to really reinforce the main point of this, and that the sacrifice that these men made, that these families made in their new homeland, many of them almost literally came off the boat, months before the Civil War broke out, was because America represented something shining, something important, something in which, again, that skill set, that Vikings-based skill set, self-reliance, courage, of commitment to sacrifice for family and community, and taking one's own path in order to do so, that those skill set was brought to bear here, became part of not only of our experience in the Civil War, but also became part of the American experience, as I talk about it in those chapters. Now, that's not to say that that same skill set had died out or had vanished or had passed across the Atlantic when those large numbers of immigrants left to go seek out new lives and homes for themselves in America. Next slide. Because I was also talking about the book, that same Viking spirit, what I call the Viking heart, would persist and would be part of the lives of those who stayed behind in Scandinavia. And you really see it when you think about what happened during the Second World War, when the four Scandinavian or four Nordic countries all had to make the decision about how they would confront the coming of totalitarianism to Europe in the 1930s, in the 1940s, of Stalin to their east, of Hitler from the south. And as I described in the book, one by one, each country had to choose for themselves where their destiny lay in it. In the case of Finland, in the case of Norway, they chose to fight and paid a terrible price for it, particularly the Finns, who would find themselves engaged in fighting the Russians not once, but twice, and fighting against the Germans as well towards the end of World War II. For the Norwegians, who also chose to resist, it meant succumbing and being occupied by Nazi forces for the duration of the war. For Denmark as well, the Germans struck really before the Danes really had a chance to really decide for themselves whether they were going to side with the Allies or try to remain neutral, and they would be under Nazi occupation from that point forward. And in the case of Sweden, looking to what the experience was from their neighbors, they decided that the most prudent course was to maintain a strict neutrality, which meant that although later on they would be blamed for having helped economically Nazi Germany was supplying them with iron ore and other resources, it did enable them to provide, to protect their independence, and ultimately as well to provide a safe haven for other Scandinavians who were conducting resistance and looking for ways in which to fight back against the Nazi regime and the Nazi world order. And as for the Norwegians themselves, even those for living under occupation, those who chose resistance would choose one of the most heroic paths for the entire history of the Second World War. And you're looking at them now. These are the Norwegian volunteers with their skis who would set out to go and to sabotage the German heavy water facilities at Femork, at the big hydroelectric plant there in Femork in northern Norway, in one of the most forbidding landscapes and wildernesses, even by Norwegian standards, and who in the process of their exploits, which I talk about in detail in the book, through their exploits, managed to prevent the German experiments with heavy water as a means by which to create a nuclear fission bomb. Probably did more than any other small group of resistance fighters to save Europe from the Nazis. How far the Germans might have gotten in terms of building an atomic bomb before or even at the same time as our own efforts here in this country, the Manhattan Project, is hard to discern. But it was thanks to these intrepid Norwegian resistance fighters that effort, that Nazi effort at building the bomb, was finally and decisively stopped. Now, in the post-war period also, we can sort of see that Viking legacy persist, even though Scandinavians, especially today, in terms of their cultural attitudes and mindset, certainly bear no relation to their more ferocious and deadly forebears. Go to the next slide. But we can see it in terms of another impact that Scandinavia would have on the rest of Europe and really on the rest of the world, and that is through the development of Scandinavian design. Design in furniture, design in furnishings, design in everything down to silverware and flatware and prints and clothing, the whole range of things. It's I think summarized from this photograph of sort of the Scandinavian Design House from the 1950s. That what we see with this is the other part of that Scandinavian genius being expressed, this Viking heart, if you like, being expressed through the way in which we shape our everyday lives, the way in which we shape the environment for that. And that is that all of that Scandinavian design, all of that work that went into creating chairs and tables, all the other aspects of interior decoration and design, was all focused on making home life the center, an important center for social interaction, but also for a personal recreation here. And this roots all the way back to the age of the Vikings, roots all the way back to that whole idea of home as the place which is not only central to survival for warmth, but also for the most important relationships on which human beings build their identities and ultimately build their destinies as well. That the aspect of building that comfortable, warm, supportive, cozy environment is part of what it is that enabled not only the Vikings to survive, but is part of the legacy that they passed on as well. I've become more and more convinced that that link is there. The Danes even have a term for it, which is hygge, coziness. It's more than just a coziness in a physical sense. It's a coziness in terms of our warm human relations with others, and the way in which community and the way in which our sense of trust in others is built around that same virtue. Next slide. And then finally, I think I will say this, that recent events and what's happening today brings out another aspect of that Viking heart, at its survival in the Scandinavian countries and in that world today. And that has been what has been happening and transpiring just in the last couple of years here. And in many ways, the story that we were all experiencing and have been watching with anticipation and horror, the war in Ukraine, is part of that story. And that is the degree to which the Scandinavian countries, and Norway and Denmark in particular, have really become now the frontier in confronting aggression, in confronting militarism, as it's being expressed from the empire that Vladimir Putin has been building and who has ambitions to build at the same time. That like these soldiers, Norwegian soldiers as part of their Arctic unit, that frontier now extends into their own homeland, the realm of the Arctic, which thanks to global warming is becoming increasingly a hotspot in terms of geopolitical competition. I work on this myself as part of my work that I'm doing at the Hudson Institute in my day job as a policy analyst in Washington, D.C. And that what we are seeing today is that those nations, those Scandinavian and Nordic nations, have now become the front line, the next front line in confronting aggression and confronting the dangers that are posed in their own backyard, in their own homeland, and that we share as on the basis of our own proximity to that world, the world of the Arctic, the world of the Arctic Circle, and of the changes that are taking place there, the struggle for resources and for strategic advantage in that world. And it's interesting, go to the last slide. Interesting when we look at the faces of these Norwegian soldiers as they engage in exercises with our US Marines, by the way. This was just a year ago that they conducted joint exercises in the Arctic with it. That we see in this young warrior here, the young Norwegian warrior, it's a kind of reflection, isn't it, of that Viking warrior that we saw on our very first slide. You could see making a chess piece out of him in precisely that same kind of way. I guess my point is that the Viking heart isn't about racial characteristics. It's not about being of a Nordic race, all that kind of nonsense that racist ideologues sometimes push about when they talk about the Vikings and the Viking legacy. It's a cultural legacy. It's one which took root in that part of the world, centuries ago that broke out during Europe's dark ages and helped to change Europe in many ways for the better during that dark age period. It's one that was preserved and changed and transformed in Scandinavia with the coming of Christianity and then the Reformation. It's one that has spread out across to America, thanks to the Great Migration at the end in the later 19th century as well. But it's also one, as my book points out, it's one that remains and stays and preserved in those communities themselves, in their original homes. And what I really hope you'll be able to get, not just from this talk, but from reading the book, is the degree to which that, what I call the Viking heart, that cultural skills, self-reliance, courage, being willingness to take on risk for the benefit of the community, to bring back the things here, is a really imperishable part of what makes not just America, not just Scandinavia, such important, such unusual places, but it's an imperishable part of the human personality. And it's one that I think may ultimately be the real reason we're so fascinated by the Vikings, because we see in them not just their rapacity and not just their ferociousness as warriors, but we see in them the qualities that are the best in ourselves as well. Thank you. Thank you for attending.